Well, welcome to Archaeology and the Bible, or evidence for the Bible. You know, one of the things I love about the Bible, or one of the many things I love about it, is that it's full of history. And there are two reasons why I love it for that. One is because it is not just ordinary history. It's full of God's history. It tells us the history of the universe, planet Earth, the human race, what went wrong, how God has planned to put it all right, and then how he did put it right. I love it for that reason. The other reason I love it for being full of history is because there are so many people today who tell you the Bible is nonsense. You can't believe it. You're all familiar with that. But I love the fact that you can say, but listen, the Bible is accurate history, and because it's full of history, you can check it out. And that's what we're going to do this evening. We're going to check it out. Now, in checking it out, I'm going to be moving fast. So those of you who may want to take notes, you needn't bother to take notes, because I'll tell you how you can remember everything afterwards. You'll forget everything I've said before the end. But we're going to be looking at the subject of, yes, archaeology and the Bible. Archaeology. Well, that might be all right for some people like Danny, but for most people it's a turn-off. Archaeology. Well, it's easy to remember. Archaeology is rubbish. It really is. It's the study of durable rubbish, the leftovers of previous generations and civilizations. When you send stuff in the trash can and it goes down to the landfill site, in 300 years' time, that will be a treasure trove for archaeologists. They'll be digging it up to find out how you lived, what you ate, and what you threw away. They'll love it. So there's a good reason for chucking it in the landfill site. Archaeology and the Bible. Professor Donald Wiseman, who was, until he died a few years ago, was one of the finest archaeologists in the world. He was a worldwide Assyriologist. He said to me once, archaeology, correctly understood, always confirms the accuracy of the Bible. And what we're going to do now is to look at some of those people and events that some people thought never existed. We're going to look at people and events that were dismissed. They were in the Bible, they were nowhere else, and therefore they didn't exist. And we're going to show how, again and again and again, the experts got it wrong. Let's start, not quite at the beginning, but pretty close to the beginning, the global flood. Now, most of you may know that a catastrophic flood is well embedded in the ancient traditions of nations right across the world, including places like Alaska, China, Egypt, Guyana, Hawaii, India, Iran, Mexico, North America, Papua New Guinea, Peru, and Russia. In fact, with the exception of Antarctica, and you might work out why, every continent has flood ideas, traditions. Now, some of them are quite wacky, you know, riding out the flood on the back of a turtle and things like that. But they are all recognizing a flood, even in places where they're a long, long way away from the water. But we're going to go back to the ancient Near East and look at some that are closest in resemblance to the biblical record. Here are two: Atrahasis epic, that was mentioned earlier, and the Gilgamesh epic. Now, let me tell you briefly the story of the Gilgamesh epic. Gilgamesh wants to get immortality, and he meets up with Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim says, I was told by the god Ea that there was going to be a big flood on the land, and I had to build a big boat. I got the dimensions, and I built the big boat. He built this big 6-decker. He was told to bring representatives of the animal kingdom into the big boat. He was told to bring his family into big boat, and he rode out a terrifying flood for 1 week. In fact, it was such a terrifying flood that even the gods, the lesser gods, were terrified by it and were afraid. And then eventually he sent out a dove, a raven, and a swallow, and in his case the raven didn't come back, so he knew it hit dry land somewhere, got out, and he worshipped the gods. You can see immediately some similarities. Now that is encouraging, not discouraging, because it means that here is a legend of the flood, and where does it come from? It comes from the more sane version that you find in the biblical record. Now, there's a little quirk in the Atrahasis record that's worth just passing on to you, because in this case, we're told that the demigods that had been created to do all the work for Enlil, the main god, they downed tools and went on strike. So they had to create the human race in order to do the work that the demigods refused to do. The trouble is, the human race made such a din on earth that it gave the gods a headache. And so they decided they'd have to bring a flood to wipe out the whole of the earth. That was the origin of the flood, a headache among the gods. Now, all this is encouraging because it does at least tell us that right close to the biblical origin of the flood, right there in the Mesopotamian area, where we have the record of a global flood right over the whole of planet Earth, that there were the people were picking up the story as generation went on after generation, and it spread across the world. So when people tell you there are many stories of the flood, don't be fazed by that. Say, yep, I know that. And in fact, isn't that encouraging? Where do you think the idea comes from? It comes right from there in the Bible. Oh, and by the way, don't forget, of course, that Jesus and the prophet Isaiah and the apostle Peter all believed in a global flood that was a fact of history. Let's move on a little bit from that. Did Abraham exist? You see, one of the problems is the only reference we have of Abraham is in the Bible. So he didn't exist. Now, to this day, we don't have any reference to our Abraham outside of the Bible. But we've got some interesting references. This is an inscription desk of the Mari people, of the Mari, the capital of the ancient Amorites. Now, the Amorites are mentioned around 78 times throughout the Old Testament. They come in lists again and again and again. And they were generally enemies of the people of Israel, and they were one of the many tribes that were taken over when the people went into the Promised Land. And the Mari, the great capital of the Maris, was discovered in 1935. And they discovered the 6-acre palace, 600 rooms on 2 levels. But much more important than that was the fact that there were some 20,000 clay tablets, like the one you're looking at, that came to light. And this told us a huge amount of the Ammonite people. Now, the Amorite people were there, roughly speaking, at the time of Abraham. And we learn a lot about their culture. And Professor Daniel Fleming, an expert in the Mari documents, has given us the understanding of so much of the culture of the Amorites that's revealed there. And the names that you find. Names in their documents like Noah and Abraham and Laban and Jacob and Gad and Dan and Levi, and many place names that are there. That are well known in the Bible. Now, those names, those people's names, are not the same people as ours in the Bible, but it shows that those names are very familiar at that time. And the culture is very, very similar to the one that we know is revealed in the book of Genesis. In fact, let me tell you a little bit about the time of Abraham. If you think that Abraham and Sarah were really very primitive people, came from a very primitive society, then stop thinking like that and think again. You're looking at some correspondence, and let me tell you that from that time there are thousands of little clay tablets like this, yes, from 500 years before Abraham even. When Sir Leonard Woolley dug up Ur of the Chaldees, not all of it, but a good bit of it, which was where Abraham started out in life, when he dug it up around about in the 1920s, he discovered that 1 in 5 homes had writing material in them. He discovered that Abraham and Sarah could have lived in a 2-story house with a bedroom, reception room, kitchen, and some primitive plumbing as well. And we know now that these people were skilled in mathematics, they were skilled in quadratic equations, they were skilled in geometry and in algebra, and they knew, wait for it, they had a working knowledge of the theorem of Pythagoras 1,500 years before the Greek philosopher was even born. And you're looking at a writing tablet. Now, there are loads of these. On the extreme left-hand side, you have the letter. You want to send a message. There are thousands of these, and there's many, many tens of thousands, I repeat, tens of thousands, In the museums of our world, the British Museum have got loads as well, and they haven't yet been translated. What might we read yet? There are marriage contracts. There are property deals. There are rental things for property. This is the one you're looking at, is actually for the rent of a room in a temple. And you simply write it on a piece of clay, back and front. You flip it over like this when you want to turn the page, with a little square-ended spatula, like a lollipop stick, you just punch it in, and you get this little dagger kind of writing. You put it inside the envelope. You slap the top over the top of it. Actually, the letter was put in when it was damp in this case, because it's come out in reverse on the back, and then you seal it round, stick a stamp on it, put it in the envelope, and it gets delivered. Well, maybe. But there are thousands of these. And there are orders for goods. There was trade going on all around the Mesopotamian area in the ancient Near East. There are goods for the orders. There are complaints of the delivery of wrong goods and inferior quality goods 4,500 years ago. Nothing changes. And all that in the time of Abraham. He came from a very, very sophisticated society. And God told him to go out into the desert, not knowing where he was going. And he became a nomad. Oh, and by the way, if you go online and just Google in Abraham's camels, you'll come up with people that still tell you that the Bible is wrong, you see, because Abraham, we are told, had a great herd of camels when he was in Egypt. And we know that camels were not domesticated 2000 BC. Well, really? That's because they don't do their homework. Now, here's the impression of a seal. There are two kinds of seals. There's the cylinder seal, which is a little bit thicker than your finger and carved round it, and then it's rolled over a piece of soft clay. It's like your ID card, your Visa card, if you like. Or there's the flat seal, which you carve on a piece of a stone, and then you slap it on the seal. Now, this is the seal impression of a cylinder seal. And can you see, look carefully. There are two, actually it's only one, but it's come out twice. There are two-humped camels with people sitting on them. Can you see that? Well, this may just help you a little bit to pick it out. Got it? All right. That may not be how you'd draw a camel. It's probably better than I would. But anyway, there are two-humped camels. This is within a couple of hundred years of the time of Abraham. And that, in archaeological terms, is next door. So we know that camels were domesticated even before the time of Abraham. The idea that the narratives of Abraham and his family were invented during the time of the monarchy at the earliest is, according to Professor Kenneth Kitchen of Liverpool University in England, without a particle of supporting evidence. The culture of the time of Abraham is as revealed in the Bible, is exactly as we have it in the known records that have been left us of that time. Abraham fits just where he belongs, and one day we may well come up with his name, on a document that has not yet been translated. And who were the Hittites? You say, I don't know who the Hittites were. Well, I'll tell you. They were a very fierce people. They come up a lot in the Old Testament. In fact, Abraham bought a field to bury Sarah in from the Hittites. And you may also recall that one of David's generals was a Hittite, Uriah, Bathsheba's husband. And yet, because we only knew the Hittites from the Bible and they were known nowhere else, they didn't exist. Remember, we're looking at people and events that didn't exist because they were only in the Bible. And then in 1906, in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, Hattusis, the capital of the Hittites, was discovered. It told us a huge amount about them. The palace was covered an area and covered a huge area, and there were many, many rooms in it. The Hittites are now well known. Some of you may have even seen programs. The BBC ran a program not long ago on the Hittites. They are very well known. Today, nobody doubts the Hittites. Hey, and more than that, Not only was their ancient capital discovered in Turkey in 1906, but we now know that they fought a very famous battle, one of the most famous battles in the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh in 1274, and it was against Ramesses II, one of the most famous of all the pharaohs of Egypt, and one of the most powerful, and the one who built more monuments to himself than any other pharaoh. And they fought a battle. It was a terrible battle. They fought themselves to a standstill, and they were going to resume it the next day, and then realized they'd all run out of steam, and they couldn't. So eventually it left to what is considered to be the first peace treaty, known peace treaty in the world. But of course, in the ancient world, when you fought a battle and you either lost or didn't win, you've got to go back home and make it look as though you really won. So when Ramesses II went back home to Egypt, he made it clear to everybody that he won, and he made this little temple to himself. And if I tell you that each one of the 4 figurines there is 60 feet high, you'll get an idea of what it's like at Abel Simnel. And if you go inside there, you're not allowed to take pictures inside, but if you go inside there, the walls are painted beautifully with this Ramesses II treading on all his enemy Hittites, the people that never existed because they were only in the Bible. Everybody believes in the Hittites today. Nobody doubts them. That's the flood. That's Abraham. That's the Hittites. David, a legendary hero, you say? Surely not. Surely, yeah. Critics for many, many years claimed that David never existed. He was a legendary king. And in fact, what happened was simply this. Either in the time of Josiah or even later, more likely in the time when the Jews were in exile, in the Persian exile, that would be after 539 BC, when they'd been taken into Persian exile, the Jewish scribes sat down and they wrote a history of Israel to bolster their morale while they were in the land of exile. And David was their great heroic king. Now, just as an aside, can you think of a story of David, if you were making him out to be a heroic king, you wouldn't have included? You've got it. All right. Anyway, they were dumb enough to make that story up. And here's the great heroic king. Because, you see, there was no evidence of David anywhere outside the Bible. Well, that was until as recently, actually, as 1993, when the Tel Dan inscription was discovered. Discovered at a place called Dan in northern Israel, and it was the ruins of, and hence it was Tel Dan, because tel is the Aramaic word for a ruin mound, like a big rubbish tip, really, trash tip. And Tel Dan produced this inscription. What is it? It's the King Hazael of Syria, who refers to the fact that he killed the king of Israel and the king of the house of David, the dynasty of David. Now, no one doubts that this is 796 BC. It has to be because of King Hazael of Syria. That's his dates, and it fits perfectly what we know and where it was found and so on. No one doubts that. But the very fact that he refers to the dynasty or the house of David is interesting because it's only 175 years after David, but more to the point, 300 years before the legends of David were supposedly invented. No one today, no serious archaeologist today doubts the existence of David. Of course, they say he wasn't quite as powerful as the Bible says he is, although there's evidence to the contrary of that now, but that's another story I haven't time to tell you. But this David, who never existed, now everybody accepts that he really was not a legendary hero, but a real figure of history. And here's another king that never existed. So you see, we've got the flood, we've got Abraham, we've got the Hittites, we've got David, and there's this guy Sargon. You see, he never lived because his only reference to him was in one single verse in the Bible, Isaiah chapter 20, verse 1. And Sargon was discovered in 1843 by a French archaeologist, Paul-Émile Botta. And Paul-Émile Botta discovered Sargon's fortress, his great fortress city on the banks of the Euphrates River. And this king is now one of the best-known kings of the ancient world. He never existed, remember, but now he's one of the best-known kings of the ancient world. We've got his palace, his library. We know that one of his daughters was a poetess and a prophetess as well. This is the king who never lived, who actually guarded his palace with two huge 10-ton, 15 feet high, human-headed winged bulls, which is really not bad for a king who never lived. And he's facing a guy who is almost certainly Sennacherib, his son. And we'll come back to him a little bit later on, because there's a lot about Sennacherib in the Bible. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot about the Bible in Sennacherib as well. But before we leave Sargon, this is the Sargon who defeated Samaria. That's up in the north, Israel. And in the year 722 BC, he destroyed the capital of Israel in Samaria, and he tells us so, and the Bible tells us so, that he took a lot of the people, as all the ancient kings did, took them out of their land and scattered them in other countries that he had conquered, and then he brought people in from the other countries and settled them in Samaria. Now, when they came in, and the Bible records this quite clearly, the people brought in with them their false gods, and they stirred that in to the worship of Yahweh, the true God. So the people in the north were people that had a totally mixed religion. And the people down in the south, in Judea, based on Jerusalem, who were not defeated by Sargon, they never actually liked the people in the north. The people based on Samaria, the Samaritans, were nasty foreigners for the people down in the south. And that went all the way on until the time of Jesus. So when you read John 4 and verse 9, and you're reminded that the Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, I want you all to immediately think Sargon. We know where it started. It was his fault, 722 BC, when he conquered and defeated the north. So there we have the flood, we have Abraham, we have the Hittites, we have David, we have Sargon. What about this king who never existed, Belshazzar? Rembrandt, I don't know why he painted the picture of Belshazzar's feast, because Belshazzar only came in the book of Daniel and nowhere else in known history. So he didn't exist either. Figment of the writer's imagination. Is that all we can say about him? Well, it's even worse than that, you see, because the Bible implies that Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon when the Persians broke in 539 BC, when they broke into Babylon. It was a bloodless entry, actually, because people hated the king. But the problem is, we knew who the king was. The last king of Babylon was actually Nabonidus. Here he is, worshipping three of his gods. The last king of Babylon was Nabonidus, and yet the Bible says that the king in Babylon at the time the Persians broke in 539 was Belshazzar. It's got to be wrong, hasn't it? Well, that was until the British consul in Basra, and you all know where Basra is, actually discovered the remains of a temple that had been repaired and dedicated to the moon god. His name was Sin, but that's not our word Sin. That's just his name. And he had left 4 time capsules. Here's one of them. They're nowhere near as big as this. They're only about that big, actually, little clay barrels. And it was 4 identical time capsules. And on it, he had a prayer for himself, of course. And he added, and Belshazzar, my firstborn, the offspring of my heart. So now, because we found Belshazzar on a lump of clay, we're allowed to believe him in the Word of God in the Bible. But wait a moment. Then who's right and who's wrong? I thought we knew that Nabonidus was the last king of Babylon. Well, this is exactly what historians and archaeologists now know. Nabonidus had been away in Arabia fighting battles for the last 10 years, and he had put his son Belshazzar on the throne as de facto king, and he was on the throne in Babylon, and he was having a whoopee time when, in fact, he saw that writing on the wall, and Daniel interpreted it for him, translated it for him, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and that very night the enemy broke in, and Belshazzar was killed. So actually, when Daniel was made third ruler in the kingdom as a result of that. Number one, it was a very short-lived honor. And number two, we now know why he was the third ruler, because Nabonidus was number one, Belshazzar was number two, Daniel could only be number three. Fits perfectly. Remember what we're doing? We're looking at some people and events that supposedly never existed. We've got the flood, we've got Abraham, we've got the Hittites, we've got Sargon, we've got David, and we've got Belshazzar. What about this place, Nineveh, the magnificent capital of Assyria in the time of Sennacherib, the king we've just been thinking about earlier? The problem is, when the Babylons destroyed it, they destroyed it so well that it just disappeared. So where on earth was it? Is it? Or was it ever? In fact, until the 19th century, they were beginning to believe that maybe there never was a place because, you got it, it was only found in the Bible. Well, the problem was compounded because two little prophets in the Bible, Nahum, he's very small, you'll find him, I promise you he's there, and Zephaniah, he's there as well, he's a bit bigger, but you'll find him. They prophesied of Nineveh. Nahum said, Nahum 3:15, their fire will devour you. And Zephaniah, God said Nineveh would be made a desolation, a dry waste like the desert. And that is exactly what happened. And we now know that because when Nineveh was eventually discovered in 1847 by Austin Henry Laird, an English archaeologist, the whole city came to life. And the burnt walls, fire-blackened walls, you can see right there in front of you, where the scorching of the walls of the intense heat. And that's exactly what happened in 612 BC, when the Babylonians actually destroyed the city and wreaked revenge, because earlier the Assyrians had been to Babylon and had done the same thing to them. So it was payback time to Assyria, making Nineveh a desolation, a dry waste in the desert, and the whole city disappeared under the desert floor until in 1847 it was discovered. And when it was discovered, it made news, international news, because a biblical story was literally coming out of the ground. Well, let's go and look at that story just for a moment. You remember the guy who was chatting with his dad earlier? Sargon on the left and Sennacherib on the right. Sennacherib, on his father's death, took over the power of the kingdom, and the very first thing he did was want to collect rent from all the subject nations that should have been paying him. This is all written in the Bible, and it's all written in Sennacherib's records as well. In fact, this is not a Bible text. This is Sennacherib's record himself. He says, and as to Hezekiah, pagan kings refer to kings are as to Hezekiah's walled forts and news, because here was a battle from the beginning to the end put out for us all to see. It's now how we know what ancient warfare was like. And you can see the battering ram. I'd love to talk to you more about that battering ram, but I haven't got time. But this is how we know what battering rams were like in the ancient world. And down on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see people. It's an early form of crucifixion. The Assyrians would put a stake through a man's stomach or his groin and leave him to die. And all through this tremendous panel all the way round until you have people right at the end, some of the leaders being spread out and literally flayed alive, with the children being made to watch. And it's quite significant that I'm not showing you a picture of that, but you can see children escaping with their parents, even in the one in front of you there. It's a biblical battle that's coming right out of the ground. And right at the end, you have the king sitting on his throne receiving the booty. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, besieging with all his forces. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Hezekiah had 3 or 4 years of warning that the army was on the way. It took time for the army to get through the land and do all this destructive work and lay siege to Lachish. And so he had time. And one of the things he had to do was deny water to the enemy, but make sure that Jerusalem was well supplied. So the Bible makes a very simple comment. It says that actually what he did was to channel water through the city, down to the west side of the city of David, with a conduit, a tunnel, which brought water into the city. How many of you here this evening have ever walked through Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem? 1, 2, 3, 4, about 2, 3, 4 of you. Okay. It's something that's quite incredible to do. You can actually walk through the tunnel that Hezekiah's engineers built, and no engineer today knows how they did it. They started at both ends. All they have is a little pick in one hand and an oil lamp in the other. We know they started at both ends because when they met in the middle, they left a plaque on the wall that told us exactly how they met. And they wind under the city, 49 meters down, 533 meters wiggling through, and the gradient is just less than 1%, just a gentle gradient, so the water keeps flowing, and it ends up in the Pool of Siloam, which was only discovered, the real Pool of Siloam, only discovered in the year 2004. And the prophet Isaiah, who was the in-house prophet at that time, had prophesied, "Thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he shall not come into this city, or shoot an arrow there, or come through to it before it with a shield, or cast up a siege mound against it." And that is exactly what happened. If you know your biblical story there, you know that the record makes it absolutely clear that overnight the army was decimated by an unseen hand, and he had to go back to Assyria, where a few years later he was slain, assassinated by 2 of his own sons, and the Bible actually gives the name of those 2 sons, one of which has been identified in Assyrian and Babylonian records. And the Greeks and the Babylonians both confirm that his army was decimated and he had to return home. They give a different reason for it. Herodotus, the Greek historian, says that mice ate all the bowstrings so that they couldn't do any more fighting. There is a biblical account that is more accurate than that, and you can go read it for yourself. But it does mean that the word of God was absolutely true, and this is significant. Sennacherib left a record of all his military campaigns. And in every single military campaign against the surrounding nations, he captured the central city and captured its king, with one single exception. And that was Hezekiah in Jerusalem. And all he can say about Hezekiah in Jerusalem on the Taylor prism is that he shut up Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. That's true. The problem is he couldn't open the cage and get the bird out. And it really was an admission of defeat, although he didn't look like that. So he went back home, and like Ramesses II with Abel-Simnel and his so-called victory over the Hittites, he had to make a wonderful victory over Israel and Judah, and it's the Lachish room that he has to put up. Let's have a look at a few more people confirmed by the spade. Here is one of the great kings of the ancient world. I thought you'd like to see him. Beautiful picture of him, isn't it? Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. He calls himself the strong man unsparing. And he tells us what he used to do when he defeated a city. He would make a terrible heap of skulls outside the city and make the rivers run with blood. And on the stela that you're looking at here, he records the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Now, that battle is not recorded in the scriptures. They don't need to record all the battles unless they've got some particular reason. But what's significant is that on the back of this, and if you nip around the back of the screen, you can see it afterwards. If on the back of it, he has a reference to this particular Battle of Karkar. It was some fight. There were 61,000 troops against him, and that included, that was the infantry, and there were 4,000 chariots, and there were 1,900 cavalry and 1,000 camels, and he defeated them. And he says he slaughtered 14,000 of them, and there wasn't room to bury the people. But the reason I'm mentioning it is because he mentions on the back, Ahab, king of Israel, put 10,000 infantry and 2,000 chariots, that's half the chariot force, into this battle. One of many occasions when ancient kings are referring to biblical kings in exactly the right position. And here's another one. Now, this is the guy who introduced Formula One to Israel, which you're all aware of, aren't you? No? Oh, come on. I know it's late and you've had a hard day. This is the guy who drove his chariot furiously, have you forgotten? Into Jerusalem. And the end of Jezebel was just on the end of that as well. Now, Jehu was a butcher and a usurper. He'd butchered his way to power, usurped the throne of Israel. He needed a few friends to keep on side. And who better than the big guy himself, Shalmaneser III? So he toddled along to Shalmaneser with a few gifts. And on the black obelisk, it's an obelisk because it's four-sided and it tapers at the top, and it's called a black obelisk because it's black limestone. And on the black obelisk, there is a list of 5 kings who are bringing tribute to Shalmaneser III. And the second row down has a kneeling figure there bringing tribute to him. And the text above it, in cuneiform writing, tells us that this is Jehu, son of Omri, bringing tribute to the king. And as you go round the obelisk, you will see all the gifts that he brought. Another king, Ahab, Jehu, mentioned very clearly in ancient pagan records. This is incidentally the only depiction we have of an Israelite or Judean king, which is not surprising because even at their worst, they obeyed the commandment not to make a graven image of their king. And you might be interested in this. I mentioned earlier the seal impression of what I said was a cylinder seal. Now, these are some seal impressions of the flat seals, if you like, the one carved in stone and slapped onto a piece of clay. And here's a seal impression that has on it Ahaz, king of Judah, and Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. Now listen, everything I'm telling you is accepted by the world of archaeology, and this is not denied. They accept this. I can tell you how they found them later on if you want me to. And this one belongs to Shebnayahu, or Shebna, the servant of the king. Now, he was the bad boy in the palace. And if you want to know why he was a bad boy in the palace, just read Isaiah 22 and you'll find out. But I love this. You remember Jeremiah? He was the prophet, in-house prophet, at the time when the Babylonians were closing in on the city. And whereas Isaiah told the people in the city of Jerusalem, it's okay, God's on your side. He's not going to break in. Sennacherib won't get into this city. Jeremiah, a few centuries later, had a very different message. He said, it's all up. God's finished with you. You might as well surrender now. Now, that didn't go down very well with people trying to defend themselves against the Babylonians. He was the most hated man in the city. And in fact, so hated that you may recall how they dropped him into a well, and it was only an Ethiopian who pulled him out again. But two of the big conspirators against him was Gedaliah, son of Pasha, and Jehukal, son of Shelemiah. And here's their seals. Nobody doubts that these are the seals of those two guys. But this is the best one. Jeremiah had a scribe. He's the guy who would write down the prophecy that Jeremiah would give. And his name was Baruch, or Berechiah. His name appears often in the book of Jeremiah. You'll find it, Baruch, Berechiah, and here is his seal. In fact, there were two seals. The other one, not this one, the other one's got a fingerprint on it. Do you know we might even have the fingerprint of Jeremiah's secretary, Baruch? Now listen, I didn't say we have. I said we could have. It's got to be somebody's thumbprint anyway. But these are evidences of how real these people were. People and events who once never existed. What about some instructions that were never given? Well, one of the most famous is this one. You see, when the people were brought back from, when the Persians overcame the city of Babylon, Cyrus was the top guy. He was the king of Persia, fabulously wealthy. And he made a decree, according to the Bible, that the God of heaven had given him all these kingdoms, and he told the Jews that if they wanted, they could go back to Jerusalem, they could rebuild their temple, rebuild their city, and take their gods with them. And they said, we haven't got any gods. But I'll tell you what we would like. We'd like all the stuff that Nebuchadnezzar nicked out of the temple. And he said, right, you can take that as well. And there's no recession here in Persia. We'll pay some of the costs of travel as well. All that's in the book at the end of Chronicles, books of Ezra, Nehemiah. You'll find it all there. And the critics said, nonsense. Because we know that the ancient kings, almost all of them, like Sargon, took the cream of the population out and brought other people in, but they didn't do the opposite. They didn't tell people you could go home. So that's wrong to start with. Well, that was until a lump of clay was found. This is known as the Cyrus cylinder. It's so important that it sits in its beautiful glass case in the middle of the British Museum, and you can walk right round it, and it's still the national icon of Iran. It went on tour there a few years ago, and they gave it back. It's a replica is in the headquarters in New York of the United Nations. It's been translated into all 27 languages of the UN, the official languages. And why? Because they consider it's the world's first, earliest charter of freedom. In fact, it's compared with our English Magna Carta. I think there's a bit OTT, frankly, but if they want to believe that, that's fine with me. And why? Well, I'll tell you why. Very simply, because in 539 BC, the king Cyrus, king of Persia, conquered Babylon, and on this cylinder he gives permission for exiled peoples to return home and rebuild their citizen temples, exactly as it's recorded in 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra 1 and Ezra 6. Now, he doesn't mention the Jews, the Israelites on this, but he mentions a lot of other nations as well. One order that was never given, but nobody doubts it today. And here's another guy. Do you recognize him? Who's that? Well, you know who he is, don't you? Caesar Augustus. Now, you remember he made a very important order, didn't he? But of course he didn't, because, well, I mean, the Jews, the Romans didn't have regular taxes, and anyway, they didn't expect people to go back to their place of birth to be registered. That's nonsense, isn't it? So they thought. We now know for a fact that the Romans had regular taxation. We've got many of them on record. And more to the point, here is a census order from the Roman governor of Egypt in the year 104 AD. That's in the time of Trajan. And he's ordering all men to return to their homes for a census. That's exactly what was commanded in the record that's there in Luke's Gospel. Just a few more people confirmed by the spade. This is, I think, interesting, because if you go to the ruins of the theatre at Corinth today, there's a marble pavement in front, and there's an inscription on it, and it says, Erastus, the city treasurer, laid the pavement at his own expense. And when Paul is writing to the Romans, he's writing from Corinth, and this is one of the greetings he gives. He says that Erastus, the city treasurer, is sending greetings. Now, the city treasurer and the word that is used in the inscription is not identical, but it's the same position with a financial responsibility. This is almost certainly the Erastus in Paul's letter to the Romans, and the one who laid the pavement. And one of the reasons for that is that according to the Greek lexicon of proper names, only 1 in 1,100 men would have the word name Erastus. Not a common name like Brian, but it was a very unusual name. We almost certainly have a reference here to the biblical Erastus. But what is unquestionable is that when Paul and Barnabas wound up on Cyprus at Paphos, Luke, recording it, tells us that Paul was a man, that Sergius Paulus was the Roman governor at that time. And he was, he says, a man of intelligence. Well, of course he was, because he accepted the gospel. And an inscription discovered in 1877 near Paphos on Cyprus confirms that Sergius Paulus was proconsul in AD 47, exactly at that time when Paul and Barnabas would have been there. I want briefly to introduce this guy to you. Now, an archaeologist is really a scholar with a bucket and spade. And Professor William Ramsay, who was professor at Oxford and Aberdeen, he gained 3 honorary fellowships, 9 honorary doctorates. He was knighted in 1906 and gained the Victorian Medal of the Royal Geographical Society for his work in archaeology of Asia Minor, that is modern-day Turkey, at the time Luke wrote his Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. Now, he was not a fool. He was a sharp guy. But what's interesting with William Ramsay, it was that when he began his training and his studies, he went to Germany, to Tübingen, and he studied under some of the greatest German critics of the day. And they told him, if you go to Asia Minor and you start digging up Asia Minor, you will discover that the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles don't figure in history. They'll be wrong everywhere. So he went with that in his mind. He believed that he would find out that actually Luke, if he was the writer of Acts and the Gospel, would be wrong everywhere. This was his conclusion at the end of his studies. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. Christianity did not originate in a lie, and we can and must demonstrate this. Now, his work has never to this day been exceeded. It's interested in some critical books, you don't get a reference to him, and I'll tell you why you don't get a reference to him, because he's already answered their criticisms, and they don't want anybody to do that. You're familiar with that kind of approach. Luke was a very accurate historian. You can do the sums yourself. These are mine, but you can do them yourself and check it out. In the Gospels and Acts, Luke refers to 117 living people by name, 114 towns, provinces, islands, seas, and other identifiable places, 25 political, military, social, or religious events that are well known to history. He refers to the famine in Acts 11, the famine in Judea, the expulsion of the Jews from Rome under the Emperor Claudius in Acts 18, and both of those are found in first century texts. Luke was a very accurate historian, and he wanted people to check him out. He was quite happy for that. That's why he was prepared to give names. He said, if you don't believe this, go and ask them, go and check it out. Luke must have kept a notebook. You say, a notebook in the first century? Well, yes, here's a first century notebook. Now, here's a good idea. Take a slither of wood, or if you prefer, parchment, punch a couple of holes. Actually, this one's got 4 holes, 2 on each side. Punch a couple of holes in the bottom, put a ring through it, and guess what you've made? A ring binder, a notebook. Now, the Greeks didn't have any name for this, so they stole the Latin word membrane. And when Paul was writing to Timothy, you remember he said, will you bring me the scrolls and the parchments? The word parchments he uses there is not a Greek word at all, though the rest of the letter to Timothy is in Greek. It's a Latin word, membrane. Paul was using a notebook. People were literate. People were writing. People were keeping notes. And there is no reason at all why the gospel writers should not have been keeping notes at the time that Jesus was alive. And many other people would have been doing the same. This whole idea of oral tradition, going on, Chinese whispers, the argument, it just is nonsense. There were notebooks surrounding in the first century. The Apostle Paul, in one of his letters, wrote very movingly, remember Jesus Christ risen from the dead, as preached in my gospel, for which I am suffering. If we have died with him, we will also live with him. If we endure, we will also reign with him. And the early Christians knew what it was to suffer for him. Here on this piece of marble is a crude carving of a donkey-headed man spread-eagled on a cross. And beside it, in misspelt Greek, are the words, and there's a little man standing there with his hand up in worship, are the words, Alexamenos worships his God. You see, the early Christians were often called asinari, donkey people, because Jesus rode a donkey into town. And hence the mocking piece of graffiti, a donkey-headed man on a cross. Maybe you couldn't see it very easily. I've picked it out for you here. Got it? But what I love is this. Underneath, in perfect Latin, somebody has written, Alexamenos is faithful. And I love to think that maybe at night, Alexamenos himself slipped out under the cover of darkness and completed the graffiti. You can mock, you can laugh, but Alexamenos is faithful. He's worshipping his crucified Lord. And one of the most moving pictures I think you'll ever see is this one called The Christian's Last Prayer. I want you to look at it carefully. You see the Christians kneeling there in prayer. There's an elder praying. There are women. Look carefully. There are children. And the lions and wild beasts are about to be set on them. What you haven't yet noticed is that all around there are Christians burning on stakes. Tacitus, the Roman historian, tells us that Nero actually ordered this kind of thing, illuminated his garden parties with burning Christians. They were prepared to suffer as our suffering brothers and sisters are across the world today, because they believed passionately in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you go to the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem today, as some of you doubtless will have been, you'll see there's a tomb there. Don't let them tell you that it's the tomb Jesus was buried in, because it isn't. It's actually older than that. Jesus was buried in a new tomb, 1st century. This is older than that. But it's very much like it. You can go inside, you can see where the body would have been laid, and as you turn around and come out again, you'll see there's a note on the side that says, "He's not here, for he is risen." You see, the resurrection of Jesus Christ demonstrates who he is and what he came to do. Or, as the Apostle Paul wrote, Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. He was buried, he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures. And those Scriptures we can trust. They are historically accurate. They are theologically accurate. And they are accurate for your sake and mine, that we might find true salvation in the risen Christ. Thank you for listening.